Hi everyone. My name is Jacob Elsey. I'm a graduate student in the Stuporn lab at Johns Hopkins. And we've had an ongoing collaboration with Ernst Niebuhr's lab for a human decision-making project. And we're particularly interested in the role of attention and how it's directed differently in increasingly complex choice scenarios. So why are we interested in attention in particular? Well, our everyday decisions are complex and our working memory capacity is limited. Consider taking a trip to the grocery store where we're faced with both simple and complex choice menus of options. We compare these possible options on the basis of their shared or dissimilar attributes, such as taste, texture, price, and so on. So while our everyday decisions may seem simple, they're complex in nature, yet we accomplish them with seemingly little to no effort. The decision-making process and ultimate choice is accomplished in part by the direction of attention to relevant information. And we must identify and select our preferred options somehow. Prior studies have linked attention to choice difficulty, preference, and bias, and we certainly aren't the first group to investigate the role of attention in decision-making. However, choice menus have commonly been limited in their complexity and quantifiability. From deciding between a couple simple gambles or goods like produce at the supermarket that are comprised of innumerable ill-defined or subjective attributes. So we wanted to know the extent to which there's a difference in the way in which people direct their attention while evaluating increasingly complex choice menus. And we investigated this by systematically manipulating the number of options and attributes available to inspect. So in a series of different experiments, cohorts of human participants evaluated two option, two attribute choice menus in the simplest case, each comprised of attributes representing the amount to win and the probability of winning that amount between 0 cents and $1. Further, we examined the relative contribution of the number of options in experiment 2 and attributes in experiments 3, which included 2 additional attributes, an amount to lose and delay to feedback on the outcome of the gamble. And finally, our most complex version comprised of 4 options and 4 attributes. Our experimental design prioritized a level of abstraction that's complex, not oversimplified, yet controlled and easily quantifiable. And we found that subjects predominantly used 2 different strategies to evaluate these choice menus. So first, let's walk through an example trial in our simplest case. So as I mentioned, we used an eye tracker to monitor which attributes were expected during the decision-making process of each trial. So to begin the trial, subjects will fixate on the central fixation cross, and then they're free to inspect the attributes as many times as they'd like, as long as they'd like, but only upon active fixation would they be able to see the magnitude of each attribute. And then once they were ready to make a decision, then they indicated their choice with a keypress, again, with no time constraint. And it's important to note, and then they'd receive feedback on the outcome of the gamble. And we wanted to particularly dissociate both the attribute sampling process and the ultimate time of choice. So what I'm going to talk about today is how people chose, what their choice behavior was, what some of those sampling strategies were. In this case, the exhaustive and filtering sampling strategy is what we term them, and then a quick conclusion. So first, there's 2 distinct choice menu types, the first being dominated, and those are essentially our catch trials where all attributes were superior than the other available options. But we were particularly interested in our non-dominated pairings, and these were comprised of options that were uniquely superior in one particular attribute. And these trials were used to gauge subjects' choice preference. So for our most complex 4-option 4-attribute case here, we constructed our choice menu similar to Sudoku boards. So each option was first best, second best, third best, and fourth best in a given attribute type. And option types were termed according to their most superior attribute type. In this case, the amount win plus option, the probability win plus option, the amount lose plus option, and the delay plus option. And 2-option 4-attribute choice menus were constructed by randomly selecting 2 of these. 4-option 2-attribute, we just used the amount and probability, and then we just used 2 of those options for the 2-option 2-attribute experiments. Overall, in our simplest case, subjects preferred the probability win plus option. So we did have some more risk-seeking subjects, but overall people preferred this option. This is the population data, and we found that this preference was preserved across all 3 other experiments, regardless of menu complexity. And notably, in the 4-option 2-attribute experiment number 3, subjects preferred the option with the second best probability, which tells us that they aren't just choosing the option with the greatest probability while ignoring the other attributes. So in sum, as I mentioned, they preferred the probability win plus option, and they were able to identify this option regardless of menu complexity. So how do subjects direct their attention in order to accomplish this? So we propose these 2 sampling strategies. So first, this is a slowed down video of someone using the exhaustive sampling strategy. As you can see, they're inspecting the attributes belonging to each option sequentially. This strategy is typically spatial in nature, looking from left to right or top to bottom within each option. And it's a good strategy because you inspect the most information, but it takes a considerable amount of time to complete. And here is the overall proportion of information sampled for each attribute and option type for all subjects who use this strategy. And as you can see, they most frequently fixate the win amount and the probability of winning across all different option types. And here is an example of a subject using the filtering strategy. First, they are going to inspect only the probability win attribute before further inspecting, in this case, the option with the greatest probability of winning. Humans are risk averse by nature, so most, but not all participants using this strategy inspected the probability win attribute of all options first. Filtering is used to simplify the choice menu very quickly by only inspecting the attributes that are most important to the subject. And it's also less time consuming than the exhaustive strategy, but the reduction of information can lead to suboptimal choice behavior. And again, here's the overall proportion of information sampled for each attribute and option type for subjects that use this strategy. And as you can see, they most frequently fixated the probability win attribute, as well as the attributes belonging to the probability win plus option. So lastly, we were interested if there's a temporal component to these strategies and if we could bend them reliably into particular epochs. So here's an example subject using the filtering strategy. Dark colors, as you can see at the top for within option type interaction, those correspond to the frequency with which subjects made a saccade to attributes within an option type. And light colors correspond to the frequency of saccades within a particular attribute type across options. And to get these proportions, we conducted a bootstrap significance test to determine whether the use of each strategy was significant at the beginning and end of each epoch. And then we would align those fixations. So for example, this subject did not begin with within attribute sweeps to the probability attribute 100% of the time, but they did do it significantly above chance. So we would align those trials to the earliest point in which they made that sweep. And so as you can see, this subject sweeps across the probability attribute, then inspects the option with the greatest probability. An eighth of the time they'll make a choice, but the rest of the time they'll actually either make another sweep, or this darker blue indicates that they inspected the option with the second greatest probability. And in this case, they remembered where it was, and in this case, they had to sweep across the probability attribute in order to identify and inspect it again. And this is also in accordance with their choice behavior. So here is the proportion of trials where they chose the probability win plus option. It's about 75%. And when they chose the other options, it was actually the second best in the probability attribute most often. And here's another subject who actually had very similar choice behavior, but used a different version of the filtering strategy in order to identify their preferred option. So first they made a sweep to the amount attribute before inspecting the amount win plus option, and then they would inspect the probability attribute and probability win plus option. And so our overall findings for each of these strategies were that it was dependent. Subjects use both strategies across all experiments, but they disproportionately favored the exhaustive strategy in simple choice scenarios and the filtering strategy in more complex cases. And this shift was a function of the number of options, not the number of attributes that were presented. So compared to the real world, our most complex case is still fairly simple, but nevertheless, it produces a robust shift in strategy compared to our simplest case. So for the sake of time, I'll skip over this. That's just a little bit further of a description. But in conclusion, our analysis of fixation behavior during the decision-making process allows us to establish a clear link between overt behavior of subjects and their underlying cognitive mechanisms. And further, we make choices in increasingly complex environments. And when we do so, we engage these mechanisms to compute value and compare options differently. And with that, I'd like to thank members of the Stupor and Niebuhr labs, as well as our funding sources and Neuromatch for hosting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Wonderful. So please type questions in the Q&A. And in the meantime, I'll ask the first question, which is, have you looked at whether these strategies that people are using are optimal or close to optimal, or do they make sense evolutionarily? Do they maximize their earnings, for example?
Yeah, so yes and no. Basically, if what you mean by optimal is, I guess, choosing maybe the option with the highest expected value, which could be the case. And in this case, the filtering subjects who use the filtering strategy, they kind of discounted the loss attribute a lot more than we were anticipating, and we actually wanted subjects to earn money from this task, so we favored the amount to win and probability to win expected values more, so people would leave with money. But we found that subjects who use the exhaustive strategy in all menu types chose more optimally or with higher expected value than filtering subjects. But they took a considerable longer amount of time to complete each trial. So, maybe that trade-off might not be worth it if some of them would be late to class and stuff like that. So.
But they still complete the same number of trials, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If you take a long time, you don't get to go through all of the trials.
No, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, well, thank you again. That was very interesting. And let's move on to our third